It was a bitter afternoon, with the kind of grayness that seemed to settle over the small town like a heavy blanket. The streets, usually bustling with the quiet hum of everyday life, felt unusually empty today. Only a few people shuffled along, heads bent against the cold wind, lost in their own worlds. Before we get into the story, comment below where in the world you are watching from today. And if you like this story, don't forget to subscribe. Jared, his coat zipped up tightly against the chill, walked home after another exhausting day at the factory. The routine of work, day after day, had worn him down, and his steps carried the weight of that fatigue. As he turned a corner, making his way down a quieter side street, something caught his eye. There, sitting on the cracked sidewalk by the edge of the road, was a man huddled beneath a faded, worn-out coat. He had a weathered face, unshaven, eyes empty and tired. His hands gripped a chipped coffee cup as if it were the only thing left between him and the world. Jared's eyes lingered on him for a moment longer than usual, drawn in by the man's stillness, his desolation. The man's face was lined with age, but not in the way that years naturally marked someone. This was a face shaped by hardship, by time spent surviving in a world that often didn't seem to care. The man sat like a ghost, unseen by the few who passed by. But Jared couldn't walk on. Something inside him wouldn't let him ignore this moment. "Are you all right, man?" Jared asked softly, his voice uncertain, unsure whether the question was even appropriate, or if it could reach the man who sat so still, so detached from the world around him. The man's head lifted slowly, as if the effort itself was too much. His eyes met Jared's, hollow and tired. But there was something there. Something that flickered for a moment before he lowered his gaze again, as if trying to shut out the world entirely. "I've been better," the man muttered, his voice rough, as though it hadn't been used in days. "But no one ever asks, so I guess it's all right." Jared stood there for a moment, unsure of what to do. He wasn't used to this, used to seeing people like the man before him, yet never engaging. People like him were always on the fringes, ignored by the town's busy rhythm. Jared had passed them countless times in the past, always moving on, always too busy, too afraid to be involved. But this time, something was different. Without thinking, Jared's hand reached into his coat pocket. "Listen," he said, his voice hesitant but kind. "If you need something to eat, I can help." The man didn't react at first. He merely stared at Jared as though the offer didn't quite register, as though it was so far removed from his experience that it felt like an impossibility. But Jared wasn't backing down. "I'm not offering charity," Jared added, his words softer now. "Just a meal. Take it or leave it." The man's eyes flickered, something shifting in his gaze, a hint of disbelief. He hadn't expected this, hadn't expected anyone to offer him something without a motive, without looking down on him. After a long pause, he nodded, his movements slow, reluctant even, as though he couldn't quite trust the simple kindness offered to him. Jared didn't wait for a second invitation. He pulled out a sandwich and a thermos of coffee from his bag and handed them to the man. No questions, no judgment, just an act of quiet generosity. The man looked at the food, the sandwich, the coffee, his fingers brushing over the thermos. For a moment, he didn't know what to do. Then, almost imperceptibly, he nodded and slowly took the food from Jared's hands, his grip trembling slightly. "Name's Jared," the man offered as Caleb hesitated, still unsure if he could accept what Jared had given him. "Caleb," the man replied, his voice low, barely above a whisper, as though speaking felt like an effort. They stood there for a while, the silence stretching between them. But it wasn't uncomfortable. It wasn't awkward. Jared simply stayed, watching Caleb eat the sandwich slowly, savoring the warmth as if it was more than just food. It was an unexpected gift, a quiet moment of reprieve from a world that had long since forgotten him. Jared looked around, trying to find words, trying to bridge the gap that still lingered between them. But Caleb didn't seem to need them, at least not right now. He ate without speaking, without making eye contact. Jared stayed in the quiet, not pressing him, not demanding anything from him. There was no need to rush. This moment, fleeting as it was, belonged to both of them. One man, offering something small, and the other, unsure of whether it was worth receiving. After a long stretch of silence, Jared broke it again, his voice softer than before. "I'm sorry about everything that's happened to you." Caleb's hand paused halfway to his mouth, and he looked at Jared, his eyes piercing through the layers of tiredness and deflection. There was a long moment of silence, as if the question itself had stirred something in Caleb that he didn't know how to respond to. "You don't know me," Caleb finally muttered, as if he was tired of hearing people offer pity they never followed through on. "Don't be sorry. You don't know what it's like." Jared nodded, acknowledging the truth in Caleb's words. He didn't know what it was like. Not really. But standing here, offering something small and genuine, he couldn't help but feel the pull of it. He wanted to help. He wanted to change the way people treated Caleb, the way people treated those who fell through the cracks. "I don't know," Jared said quietly, "but I want to help. Just, if you ever need a place to stay, a safe space, I can help with that. No strings attached. No pity. Just rest. It's the least I can do." Caleb hesitated. He hadn't trusted anyone in a long time, especially not strangers who spoke with such easy kindness. He knew what it felt like to be used, to be seen as nothing more than a project. His instincts screamed at him to walk away, to refuse. But Jared's words hung in the air between them like a lifeline, something Caleb hadn't even known he needed. "I don't want to owe you anything," Caleb finally said, though the words came out almost as a question, as if he were still unsure of whether such an offer could be real. "You won't," Jared said firmly. "You just need a place to rest. You deserve it." Caleb stood there for a long time, the weight of his past pressing down on him. But for the first time in a long time, he didn't feel like he had to carry it alone. With a hesitant nod, Caleb spoke, his voice barely above a whisper. "All right, I'll take it. I'll come by." Jared smiled, though the smile didn't feel forced. It felt like a quiet promise. "I'll be here. Anytime." As Caleb walked away, still uncertain, but strangely lighter than he had been in weeks, Jared watched him go, wondering how this unexpected encounter would shape both their lives. They were two strangers, brought together by something as simple as a meal. Yet in that simplicity lay the potential for something much greater. Something that could bridge the gap between their worlds. Something that could change both their lives forever. And as the sun began to set, casting long shadows on the quiet streets, Jared couldn't help but feel that the world, just for a moment, had become a little bit brighter. The following days felt both heavy and light for Jared. On one hand, life had gone back to its routine. Work at the factory, a quiet dinner at home, the soft ticking of the clock marking the minutes. On the other hand, there was a lingering presence in his mind, Caleb, the homeless veteran he had helped, the man who seemed to carry the weight of the world on his shoulders. Jared hadn't expected this feeling, a nagging tug in his chest every time he thought about him. It wasn't that Jared was a stranger to helping people. He had given to charity, volunteered at food banks, and contributed to causes. But something about Caleb's quiet dignity, his reluctance to accept help, had stayed with him. He couldn't shake the feeling that there was more he could do, that he wasn't finished with this story yet. One evening, as Jared sat on his porch, his thoughts heavy, there was a soft knock at the door. He jumped slightly, as though pulled from a deep thought, and stood to answer it. When he opened the door, there stood Caleb, looking even more worn than the last time they had met. His eyes were tired, and his coat had seen better days. But there was a slight hesitation in his posture that spoke volumes. I came by," Caleb said, his voice unsure, almost apologetic. Jared smiled, stepping aside to let him in. "I'm glad you did." As Caleb entered, Jared could see how much the world had taken from him. The quiet resignation in his step, the guarded look in his eyes. Yet, there was something else, a flicker of something that Jared wasn't sure how to name. Hesitance, yes, but also a sense of relief. "You hungry?" Jared asked, his voice warm but without the weight of pity. Caleb didn't answer immediately. He looked around the modest living room, at the worn sofa, the simple furnishings, as though he was unfamiliar with the idea of comfort, the idea of having more than just bare necessities. His eyes paused on the kitchen where the faint smell of something cooking lingered. "Yeah," Caleb muttered finally, his voice almost a whisper. "I'm hungry." Jared nodded, turning toward the kitchen, but not before casting a glance at Caleb. "Come on, make yourself at home," he said, as if offering something more than food. For the first time, Caleb hesitated before sitting down on the edge of the couch. His hands were still trembling slightly as he tugged at his sleeves, trying to hide the scars that had been left by time on his body and soul. He didn't know how to feel here. Could he truly belong here? As Jared prepared the meal, he couldn't help but steal glances at Caleb. The man was a mystery. He had been in the military. He had fought for a country that had since forgotten him. He had been cast aside, left to survive on the streets while the world moved on. But now, sitting in Jared's modest home, Caleb felt like a stranger in a strange land, unsure how to navigate the kindness that Jared was offering so freely. Jared placed a steaming bowl of soup in front of Caleb and sat down across from him. There was an awkward silence as Caleb looked down at the meal, unsure whether to dive in or push it away. "You can eat," Jared said, trying to break the tension. "I'm not looking for anything in return. Just take a break." Caleb met his gaze for a moment before he picked up the spoon, the first sign of trust he'd shown. But even as he ate, there was something in the air. A sense that Caleb was waiting for the other shoe to drop, waiting for this moment of peace to be shattered by something he could not control. After a few moments, Jared cleared his throat. "You know, you don't have to keep moving on. You could stay here if you wanted." Caleb froze mid-bite, the words landing heavy in the room. Jared felt it too. The weight of that offer, the simplicity of it, and yet how huge it was. To Caleb, staying with Jared meant more than just a roof over his head. It meant trusting someone again. It meant stepping into a world he had been shut out of for so long. Caleb set the spoon down, his eyes shifting away from Jared's. "I don't know if I can. I'm not used to this," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I've been on my own too long. People don't do this. They don't just help." Jared didn't flinch, didn't look away. He knew. He understood more than Caleb might realize. "I'm not asking you to be anyone but yourself. You don't have to be anything but you. And you don't have to stay forever. Just stay for a little while. Let yourself rest." The silence that followed was thick, and Caleb could feel the weight of Jared's words. No one had ever said that to him before. Not without an agenda, not without expectations. For a brief moment, he felt like he was standing on the edge of something. Something he didn't know how to grasp but desperately needed. Finally, after what seemed like an eternity, Caleb spoke, his voice rough. "I'm not used to being treated like I'm worth something." Jared leaned forward slightly, his eyes earnest. "You are worth something. You just need to believe it." That night, after they ate, Caleb lay on the couch, staring at the ceiling. Jared had offered him a room, but Caleb had politely refused. He wasn't ready for that yet. He wasn't sure if he ever would be. But in that small living room, in that simple space that smelled of soup and a warm fire, something began to shift inside him. It was subtle, but it was there. A flicker of hope, barely noticeable, but strong enough to feel like a start. Jared turned off the lights, quietly retreating to his own room. The house felt different now. It felt fuller, not in the material sense, but in a way that Jared hadn't expected. Caleb's presence filled the space, not with noise, but with a quiet understanding. The house wasn't just his anymore. It had become theirs. As Jared closed his door, he allowed himself a brief moment of reflection. He had extended the offer, yes, but now the ball was in Caleb's court. And whatever came next, whatever decisions Caleb made, would shape the rest of their story. Jared couldn't have known that this was just the beginning. That one act of kindness, one simple offer of a meal and a place to rest, would soon set off a chain of events neither of them could predict. But for tonight, there was peace. Small, fragile, but real. And for Caleb, that was enough. The next morning, Caleb was gone. There was no note, no goodbye, just the quiet absence of his presence. Jared stood for a long moment, his heart heavy with uncertainty. But then, a sound at the door broke the silence, a soft knock. Jared opened the door to find Caleb standing there, hesitant but resolute. He didn't say anything at first. He just stood there, looking at Jared as though weighing something in his mind. Finally, Caleb spoke, his voice quiet but sure. "I'll stay for a while, if that's okay." Jared smiled, his heart lifting. "Of course. You're welcome here." And just like that, the journey had begun. One that would test both men in ways they hadn't imagined. The morning light filtered softly through the blinds, casting a warm glow on the modest furnishings of Jared's home. Caleb woke up early, the faint sounds of birds chirping outside the window drawing him from a restless sleep. The night had been quiet, and for the first time in a long time, Caleb didn't feel like he was constantly on edge. He didn't have to sleep with one eye open, anticipating the next harsh word or the next turn of bad luck. But the moment he opened his eyes, the weight of the previous day's decision hit him once more. He had agreed to stay. Stay. The word felt foreign on his tongue, like something he'd forgotten how to do. He had lived on the streets for so long, a drifter by necessity, that the idea of having a place to call his own, of being accepted, not as a charity case, but as a human being, seemed almost too good to be true. For a moment, he wondered if he'd made the right choice. Maybe it was a mistake. Maybe he was just fooling himself into believing that things could change, that he could belong somewhere again. But as he lay there in the quiet room, he couldn't deny the small sliver of hope that had started to grow in him, despite his own reluctance to fully embrace it. Jared's house, simple and modest, was the kind of place that could easily be overlooked in a town like theirs. But Caleb saw it differently now. It was a shelter, not just from the elements, but from the harshness of the world outside, a world that had long since written him off. He stood, stretching his sore muscles, and stepped quietly into the living room. The house was still and peaceful, the kind of stillness that made Caleb uneasy at first, but, in time, he began to appreciate it. Jared was already awake, sitting at the kitchen table with a mug of coffee in hand. There was a newspaper spread out in front of him, but his eyes were focused elsewhere, lost in thought. He didn't notice Caleb at first. Caleb hesitated, standing in the doorway of the kitchen. He wasn't sure what to do next. How did one behave in someone else's home after living a life of uncertainty and isolation? Jared looked up, catching Caleb's gaze. His face broke into a small, genuine smile, the kind that reminded Caleb of the offer he had made yesterday, the kindness he had extended without asking for anything in return. "Morning," Jared greeted, his voice steady and warm, like it was the most natural thing in the world. Caleb gave a nod, though it was a hesitant one. "Morning." Jared gestured to the chair across from him. "Coffee's fresh. Help yourself if you want." Caleb hesitated again, but the temptation of the warmth, the simple kindness, made him move toward the kitchen. He poured himself a cup, the scent of the coffee filling the space between them. They didn't speak for a few moments, as if both of them were giving each other space to breathe, to figure out where to go next. Finally, Jared broke the silence, his tone casual, but with a subtle undercurrent of seriousness. "I meant what I said yesterday. You don't have to leave if you don't want to. I'm not trying to fix you, Caleb. I just thought you could use a place to rest for a while." Caleb didn't know how to respond. The words Jared spoke sounded so simple, but the weight behind them was overwhelming. He didn't feel like he deserved this, didn't feel like he belonged in a place where kindness came without strings attached. For so long, he had been rejected, overlooked. To have someone, especially someone like Jared, offer him a seat at the table, it was almost too much. "You sure about that?" Caleb asked, his voice low, the words thick with doubt. "I mean, you don't even know me. What if I'm just a burden?" Jared's smile didn't falter. "I don't think you're a burden. I think you're a person who's been through a lot. And I think that's why you're here now. Not just on my couch, but here in this house. I've got space. And I've got time. You don't have to go anywhere until you're ready." Caleb didn't know how to respond to that. He didn't know if he ever would be ready. He had lived on the streets for so long, trying to survive, trying to stay invisible, that the idea of someone truly seeing him for who he was felt alien. It was terrifying. Later that day, Caleb found himself with an unexpected amount of time on his hands. Jared had to leave for work, leaving him alone in the house for the first time since he arrived. He wandered the rooms, not really sure where to go or what to do. There was a sense of unfamiliarity in every corner, but also a strange comfort. He could hear the faint hum of the refrigerator, the tick of the clock on the wall, and for once, the sound didn't feel oppressive. It felt like peace. He sat in the living room, his fingers running across the worn fabric of the couch. His eyes scanned a small bookshelf against the wall, mostly novels, some cookbooks, and a few old photo albums. The photos caught his attention, and he stood, walking over to them. He flipped through the pages of one album, pausing to study the black and white pictures of a family that seemed so familiar in its normalcy, yet so foreign to him at the same time. Jared's family, he assumed. A wife, children, smiling faces that seemed so full of life. It was almost too much to take in. For so long, Caleb had been disconnected from families, from people who were close, who cared about one another. He had been on his own, and his mind had learned to reject the idea of closeness, the idea of acceptance. But these pictures, they made him ache with a longing he couldn't quite explain. When Jared returned home later that evening, he found Caleb sitting on the couch, the album still in his hands. He didn't look up as Jared entered, but there was something in the way Caleb was holding the album that spoke volumes. "You okay?" Jared asked, setting down his coat. Caleb hesitated before answering. "I was just looking at these." "Your family?" Jared nodded, sitting down across from him. "Yeah, that's them. My kids, when they were young. My wife and I, too." He smiled wistfully, but there was a tinge of sadness in his eyes. "It's a lot easier to look back at those days than it is to deal with the now." Caleb nodded slowly, unsure what to say. He didn't know what it was like to have a family, to have someone to lean on when things were tough. He'd never had that stability. His life had been a string of short-term things. Cities, jobs, relationships that fizzled out as quickly as they started. And now he was here, sitting in Jared's house, looking at photos of a family he could never have, wondering how to fit into a world that had never shown him this kind of love. "I'm not sure I belong here, man," Caleb finally said, his voice quiet, almost to himself. "I don't even know what to do with all of this." Jared leaned forward, his voice steady, firm but compassionate. "You belong here as much as anyone else does. You don't have to figure everything out overnight. But what I'm offering you, it's real. You're here because you need a place to heal, and I'm not going to turn you away." The silence that followed wasn't uncomfortable, but it was thick, heavy with the weight of everything Caleb was trying to process. He didn't know if he could accept this. He didn't know if he could trust it. But for the first time in a long time, he allowed himself to believe that maybe, just maybe, there was hope. As the evening unfolded, the house felt warmer than it ever had before. Jared and Caleb didn't talk much more after that. But somehow, it felt like there was more understanding between them now than there had been before. Caleb had taken a step towards something he wasn't sure he could handle, and Jared had given him the space to breathe. It wasn't much, but for Caleb, it was enough, for now. The days passed in a strange, tentative quiet. Caleb found himself staying at Jared's house, accepting his kindness, even as his own mind grappled with the idea of being cared for. He had always been a man who survived on his own, always keeping his guard up. The act of letting someone else care for him felt as foreign as it was terrifying. But Jared never pushed him. He gave him space, allowed him to settle into the routine of the house. It was more than just a bed and a roof. It was the first real sense of belonging Caleb had felt in years. But as the days wore on, the unease began to build. Jared had told him that he didn't have to leave until he was ready. But now, Caleb felt like a guest in someone else's life, a constant reminder of a world that hadn't accepted him. Every time he looked in the mirror, he saw a man who didn't belong, who couldn't belong. One evening, as Caleb was returning from a walk around the block, trying to sort his thoughts in the chilly air, he noticed the group of men standing on the corner across from Jared's house. They were talking loudly, and Caleb could hear the laughter from where he stood. But something about their tone made him uneasy. One of the men, a burly figure who Caleb had seen around town, glanced over and spotted him. The man's face twisted into a sneer. Caleb could feel the weight of the stare, the hostility in it. He wasn't sure what they knew, but it didn't take much to realize that they had been talking about him. His presence, Jared's decision to let him stay, had stirred something ugly. Caleb had known it was coming. He just didn't know how soon. Inside the house, Jared had been sitting at the kitchen table, a cup of coffee in front of him, his thoughts on Caleb and the distance he was trying to bridge in his mind. He was glad Caleb had agreed to stay longer, but he couldn't help but feel the growing tension. Caleb wasn't the only one who was uneasy. Jared had felt the weight of the town's opinion ever since that first night he had helped Caleb, and the looks he received in passing, those disapproving, judgmental stares, had only gotten worse. Then, the knock at the door came. It wasn't a polite knock, but one that felt like an announcement, a declaration of intent. Jared stood, his heart rate quickening. He knew who it was before he even reached the door. When he opened it, the man standing there was one of the same men who had been on the corner. The man was flanked by two others, their expressions as grim as his own. "Evening, Jared," the man said, his voice low and grating. "We need to talk." Jared's stomach tightened, but he kept his voice steady, knowing full well that whatever was coming would be difficult to navigate. "Sure. What's this about?" Jared asked, standing firm in the doorway. The man stepped forward, glancing over Jared's shoulder into the living room. Jared's eyes narrowed, instinctively blocking the view. He knew this was about Caleb. He could feel it in his bones. "We've heard a lot about what you've been doing," the man continued, his voice sharp. "And frankly, it's not sitting well with us. Bringing that guy into your house, helping him out. People like him don't belong here." Jared felt a surge of anger, but he kept his composure, looking the man square in the eye. "What exactly do you mean by that?" he asked, his voice calm but firm. The man looked back at him, sizing him up. His words came slowly, deliberately. "We don't need his kind around here, Jared. People like him. Black, homeless, a veteran. You're bringing trouble to this town. You think people want to see that? You're making us all look bad." Jared's pulse quickened, but he didn't back down. Caleb's a human being. He deserves a chance, just like anyone else. "I'm not going to let you dictate who I help or who stays in my house." The tension in the air grew thick. The men exchanged glances, their faces hardening as the words lingered in the space between them. "You're making a mistake," one of the other men spoke up. "You're going to cause a lot of problems for yourself, Jared. You don't know how far this can go." Jared's jaw clenched, but his voice remained steady. "I'm not scared of your threats. If you've got a problem with me helping Caleb, and you have a problem with me, but I'm not going to change what I've decided." For a moment, the men just stood there, their eyes cold and unyielding. Finally, the man in front stepped back, his tone lowering. "We warned you," he said, his voice filled with venom. "You'll see." Was that? They turned and walked off, leaving Jared standing at the door, his mind racing with a mix of anger and concern. Inside, Caleb had been listening from the living room, every word from outside piercing through him. He had been expecting something like this. In his mind, he knew that Jared's kindness would be met with resistance, but he wasn't sure he was ready for it. The idea that he could be the cause of conflict, that he could make Jared's life harder, it was too much. He wanted to leave, to disappear again into the shadows where he felt safe. When Jared entered the room, he saw Caleb standing near the window, staring out at the street where the men had been moments ago. His expression was unreadable. "They want me gone, don't they?" Caleb asked quietly, his voice low. Jared hesitated, but his words were firm. "It's not just you. It's me too. People are angry, Caleb. They don't like what I've done, but I don't care about them. You're not going anywhere. Not on my watch." Caleb turned, his face drawn with a mix of doubt and fear. "But you're the one who's going to take the heat. I'm just a problem to them. A reminder of everything they don't want to deal with." Jared took a step closer, his voice gentle but resolute. "You're not a problem. You're a person, and I'm not letting you go. Not now, not ever." Caleb looked down, his eyes filled with an emotion he couldn't quite name. He had never had anyone stand up for him like this, not like Jared was. The weight of the world felt heavy on his shoulders, and the fear of being rejected again was suffocating. But in this house, for the first time in a long time, he allowed himself to believe in the possibility of something better. The days that followed were filled with a quiet tension. Caleb couldn't shake the feeling that things were getting worse, that Jared's willingness to help him was pushing them both into a storm they couldn't control. Jared continued to stand firm, but Caleb could see the strain in his face. The whispers around town were only growing louder, and the backlash was becoming more real, more dangerous. One evening, as Caleb sat alone in the living room, he heard Jared's voice outside. He stepped to the window, and what he saw made his stomach drop. A group of men were standing across the street, shouting, holding signs, some of them even yelling at Jared as he tried to walk to his car. The anger in their voices was palpable, filled with threats, venom, and something darker. Caleb's heart raced. This wasn't just about him anymore. It was about Jared, and the fear of seeing someone he cared about being torn apart by hate was more than he could bear. Jared stood his ground, walking calmly despite the insults, despite the anger. And in that moment, Caleb realized that whatever came next, whatever battles they faced, they would face together. The storm was coming, but it was not just one of words. It was a battle that would test both men in ways they hadn't prepared for. And as the town rumbled with discontent, Jared and Caleb would find out just how strong they truly were. The days that followed the confrontation with the townspeople felt heavy for both Jared and Caleb. The tension in the town was palpable, like the air before a storm, thick and suffocating. Jared had always lived in this town, and though he had never been particularly close to the majority of its residents, he knew the landscape, both literal and figurative. It was a town where people kept their heads down, where anyone who stood out was quickly silenced by the whispers of the majority. But now, Jared had become something of an anomaly, a man who dared to challenge the unspoken rules of his community. The moment he had stepped up to help Caleb, it had triggered a chain reaction. It wasn't just Caleb who had become the subject of scrutiny, it was Jared too. And the consequences were far more than he had expected. As Caleb sat in the small, quiet living room that had started to feel like a safe haven for both men, he couldn't help but feel the weight of Jared's decision. The quiet of the house had become uneasy, filled with unspoken words and fears they hadn't voiced. Caleb had always been on his own, living in the shadows of the world. But now, Jared had drawn him into a battle neither of them could avoid. The knock at the door came just as the evening began to settle into the deep quiet of dusk. It was too soon. Jared, who had been sitting at the kitchen table, his thoughts lost somewhere between his fear for Caleb and his own anxiety, rose quickly, his gaze flickering toward the door. Caleb's stomach tightened as the knock sounded again, louder this time. He had grown used to the tension that hung in the air whenever someone came around. He didn't have to ask who it was. He already knew. Jared opened the door. Standing there was a group of men from town. They were the same ones who had spoken to him before, their faces filled with anger and unspoken disdain. Their eyes flickered over Jared's shoulder, their gaze settling briefly on Caleb, who stood quietly by the window, trying to keep his presence unnoticed. The leader of the group, the man who had been most vocal during their last encounter, stepped forward. His face was contorted with frustration, his fists clenched at his sides. "We've given you enough warnings, Jared," he said, his voice low and sharp. "This ends tonight." Jared stood firm in the doorway, not backing away, not flinching from the threat. "I've already told you. I'm not changing my mind. I'm helping Caleb. If that's a problem for you, then that's your issue, not mine." The man's face reddened, his jaw tightening. "It's not just our issue. The whole town is talking. People are scared, Jared. They're worried about their kids, their families. We don't need him here." Caleb could hear the words from the other room, the venom in the man's voice seeping into his bones. He closed his eyes, his fists clenched at his sides, the shame creeping up his spine like a dark shadow. For the first time in days, he wondered if he was making things worse for Jared, if his presence here had brought nothing but pain to the man who had shown him so much kindness. Jared's voice broke through his thoughts. "He's not leaving. I told you before, Caleb stays here. And if you have a problem with that, You're going to have to deal with it." The group exchanged glances, their faces dark with anger. The leader took a step forward, his chest puffing out in an attempt to intimidate Jared. "You're making a mistake, Jared. People around here don't take kindly to what you're doing. If you're too blind to see that, then maybe it's time we make you see reason." Before Jared could respond, the man shoved past him, barging into the living room. The group followed, their presence filling the space with a heaviness that threatened to suffocate. Caleb froze, his heart racing in his chest. He had seen this kind of thing before. Men like these, men who saw difference as a threat, who used their power to push others down. "You don't belong here," the leader spat, his voice rising. "None of you do." Caleb took a step back, his body trembling. He wanted to say something, to defend himself, but the words wouldn't come. He was still too broken, still too unsure of his place in this world. He had spent so long believing that his presence didn't matter, that the world had already decided who he was, and now these men were confirming it. Jared, however, didn't back down. His posture was solid, his eyes unwavering. "You've made your point," Jared said, his voice calm but firm. "But you won't intimidate me. I'm not asking for your approval. I'm not asking for your permission. Caleb's here because he needs help, and I'm giving it." One of the other men, a shorter, stockier man, scoffed and crossed his arms. "You think you can just change people's minds, Jared? You think they'll just accept it because you say so?" Jared didn't flinch. "No, but I'll make sure Caleb has a chance. That's all anyone deserves, a chance." The leader of the group stepped forward again, his face twisted in frustration. "You're not going to win this fight, Jared. You can't change people's minds just because you think it's right. You're going to cause trouble for everyone around here." Jared stepped closer to the man, standing tall. "I'm not backing down. And if that's a problem for you, then I guess we'll just have to deal with it." There was a long pause, the air sick with tension. The group seemed to weigh their options, but none of them moved. The room fell silent except for the faint rustling of the wind outside. Finally, the leader of the group sneered, his words dripping with contempt. "You're making a mistake, Jared," he said, his voice laced with a bitter edge. "But don't say we didn't warn you." The group turned and left, their footsteps echoing in the quiet house, leaving Caleb standing alone, unsure of what had just transpired. The sound of the doors slamming behind them felt like an ending, but it was more than that. It was a beginning. That night, Jared sat in the kitchen, his hands wrapped around a cup of coffee, staring out the window into the darkness. Caleb, sitting across from him, couldn't meet his eyes. The weight of what had just happened hung heavily in the air. "You don't have to go through this for me," Caleb said quietly, his voice full of guilt and regret. "You don't have to make this harder on yourself." Jared shook his head slowly. "This isn't just for you, Caleb. This is for anyone who's ever been ignored, pushed aside, told they didn't matter. I'm not backing down. Not now, not ever." Caleb looked at him, his eyes searching for the certainty he could never seem to find in himself. "I'm not worth all of this. I'm just one man, one life." Jared's eyes softened, his voice gentle. "Yours everything, Caleb. Every single person deserves a chance. Don't let anyone make you think differently." There was a long silence between them, but this time, it wasn't filled with doubt. It was filled with something else, something that neither of them could quite name. Caleb, for the first time in his life, felt seen, not as a burden, not as someone who didn't matter, but as a person. Jared's words hung in the air, a promise that Caleb wasn't sure he could believe just yet, but one he was willing to try. Together, they had started something, and no matter how difficult the road ahead might be, neither of them was going to walk it alone. The storm had arrived, but this time, Jared and Caleb were ready to face it, together. The storm that had been brewing in town for weeks finally made its way to Jared's doorstep. The discontent, the whispers, the tension that had been simmering beneath the surface finally erupted, and it was more than Jared and Caleb had anticipated. For Caleb, the overwhelming reality of the world's rejection had started to feel like a crushing weight again. But for Jared, the moment of reckoning had come. It was no longer just about helping one person. It was about standing up for what was right, no matter the cost. It was a Tuesday evening when the situation finally escalated. Jared had spent the day at the factory, his mind drifting between the responsibilities of his work and the worries that plagued him when he thought of Caleb. He knew it was only a matter of time before the town's disapproval would take its toll. When Jared arrived home, the quiet of the house felt like an illusion. It was peaceful, yes, but there was a looming sense of urgency in the air, as though everything was on the edge of breaking. Caleb was already at the kitchen table, his brow furrowed in concentration, staring at a piece of paper, an application for a job. For all the challenges he faced, Caleb had insisted that he wanted to try. He was determined not to be a burden to Jared. But even in the face of his uncertainty, Caleb was slowly starting to realize the value of hope, of trying again. The small, consistent steps he took each day were slowly building a foundation, though there were still moments where the past threatened to drag him back. When Jared walked into the room, he noticed Caleb's tense expression. There wasn't just the struggle of filling out the application. Something else was weighing on him. Jared, setting down his bag. "What's going on, Caleb?" Caleb looked up, his eyes heavy. He sighed, dropping the pen from his hand. "I saw some of them today. The ones from last week. They were talking. They looked right at me." His voice trailed off, a mix of frustration and fear in his tone. Jared paused, taking a seat across from him. He already knew what Caleb was talking about. The words, the whispers, they were growing louder. He could feel the eyes of the town on him. But it wasn't just the way they looked at Caleb. It was the judgment they were directing toward Jared for even helping him. Jared, softly. "I've heard it too, Caleb. I know. But you're not going anywhere. You're here. You belongs here." Caleb swallowed hard. "I don't want to cause trouble for you. I'm not worth all this." Jared's eyes softened as he reached out, placing a reassuring hand on Caleb's. "You are worth everything. I'm not going to let anyone push you away. Not now, not ever. You're part of this, part of my life now." The words were a balm for Caleb's soul, but there was still an unsettling unease in his chest. It wasn't just about Jared's support anymore. The people in the town had begun to make it clear that his presence was no longer just unwanted. It was dangerous. The storm was coming, and neither Caleb nor Jared knew how much longer they could hold it back. Later that evening, as darkness descended, there was a knock at the door. A sharp, insistent sound that immediately set both men on edge. Caleb's pulse quickened, his stomach tightening. He didn't need to ask who it was. Jared opened the door to find two of the town's most vocal residents. Both older men, hardened by years of living in a small, insular world where conformity was the rule. Their eyes locked on Jared, and for a brief moment, the tension between them was palpable. "Ma'am," one, gruffly, "we need to talk. Now." Jared's face tightened, but he stepped aside to allow them in. He knew this wasn't a friendly visit. This was the next escalation, and he could feel it coming like a wave. Jared, calmly, "What's this about?" Man 2, with a sneer, "It's about your guest. About him staying here." He jabbed a finger in the direction of Caleb, who was still sitting at the kitchen table, his eyes downcast. "You think you're doing the right thing, Jared? You think it's okay to let someone like him live in your house, just because he says he's a veteran? You're jeopardizing everything." Caleb stood up, his legs shaky beneath him, the fear growing like a wildfire inside him. But Jared placed a firm hand on his shoulder, signaling him to stay put, to remain calm. "Jared, resolute. Caleb's not going anywhere. He's a human being. He deserves a chance, just like anyone else." The men's expressions grew harder, their voices rising. It was clear they weren't just talking about Caleb, they were talking about Jared. The tension was about to snap. Man 1, gritting his teeth. "People don't want his kind here. And they don't want you, either, Jared. You're going to ruin everything for yourself if you keep this up. There's no place for people like him in this town." Caleb flinched at the words, but Jared's grip tightened on his shoulder. He refused to let the words break him. This was the moment he had been dreading, the moment that confirmed everything he feared about this place. He could feel the weight of the town pressing against him, suffocating him. But Jared's unwavering presence gave him strength. "Jared," steadily, If you think I'm going to turn Caleb away, then you've got it wrong. This isn't about him. This is about what's right. And I'm not going to let fear and hatred rule our lives. There was a moment of tense silence, the men standing rigid as they exchanged a look. Then, the leader of the group sneered again. Man 2, coldly. You're making a mistake, Jared. People like him don't belong in this town. If you continue this, you'll regret it. The door slammed shut behind them as they left, but the words lingered in the air like a dark cloud. Caleb stood frozen, his body tense with the shock of it all. The rawness of their words cut deep. Caleb, his voice shaky. They're right, you know. I don't belong here. I've never belonged anywhere. Jared stepped forward, his eyes locked on Caleb's. He wasn't going to let Caleb fall back into that self-doubt. Jared, firmly. You belongs here. You belongs here. Caleb, don't let anyone tell you otherwise. The silence that followed was thick with tension, but there was something different in the room now. It wasn't just the weight of the town's anger. It was the shared understanding that this fight wasn't just about Caleb anymore. It was about standing up for what was right, no matter the cost. Over the next few days, Caleb couldn't shake the feeling that they were reaching a breaking point. He spent more time in the house, pacing, unsure of where to go next, feeling the pressure of the town closing in around him. But Jared remained a constant presence, someone who wouldn't bend to the pressure, who wouldn't let Caleb feel like a burden. Jared's conviction began to anchor Caleb's own resolve. One night, as they sat together, the doorbell rang again. This time, it was a different kind of knock, more gentle, less angry. Caleb felt a flicker of hope rise in his chest, unsure of what to expect but desperate for something to break the tension. When Jared opened the door, there stood Mrs. Jenkins, the elderly woman who had apologized to Caleb weeks ago, accompanied by 2 other women from the neighborhood. They stood there hesitantly, unsure of what to say, but with a sincerity in their eyes. Mrs. Jenkins, softly, we just wanted to come by, to say that we were wrong. About Caleb, about everything. The words hung in the air. Heavy was the weight of what they meant. For Caleb, hearing those words was like the first breath of fresh air after a storm. In that moment, Jared knew they were starting to win. The backlash was far from over. But as more people from the town stepped forward, it became clear that change, though slow, was possible. The walls they had fought against had started to crack, but Caleb knew there was still much to face. And as he looked at Jared, standing steadfast by his side, he realized that no matter how hard it got, they would face it together. The storm was far from over, but now there was a glimmer of hope in the distance. The weight of the days since the confrontation hung over both Jared and Caleb like a storm cloud that refused to dissipate. The tensions in the town had only escalated, but so had the small sparks of defiance and support from unexpected places. Jared had felt it when he walked through the grocery store, the quiet glances and whispers that followed him, the thinly veiled hostility that he tried to ignore. But there were other moments, brief and fleeting, when he could feel the shift. A nod from a stranger, a word of encouragement from a neighbor who had once turned their back. Small victories, but victories nonetheless. However, the pressure was mounting. It wasn't just the looks or the whispers anymore. It was the palpable sense of urgency, an undercurrent of something darker, something that threatened to tear through the fragile peace they had managed to carve out. As the days passed, Caleb had begun to retreat into himself more and more, the weight of the town's rejection suffocating him. The cracks in his newfound sense of belonging were beginning to show, and Jared could see it, but he didn't know how to fix it. No matter how much he wanted to shield Caleb from the harshness of the world, he couldn't protect him from everything. One evening, as Jared returned home from work, the tension that had been building for weeks finally erupted. As he pulled into the driveway, his eyes flickered to the street. The familiar group of men were standing at the corner once again, their figures illuminated by the dim streetlight. Their faces were hard, and as Jared parked the car and stepped out, he could feel their eyes on him, their judgment piercing the quiet evening air. Caleb stood in the doorway, watching from the window. His heart pounded in his chest, his stomach tight with dread. The unease that had been growing in him for days threatened to consume him. He had heard the whispers at the store, the pointed glares when people walked past him on the street. He knew what was coming, and though he wanted to ignore it, to close his eyes and pretend it wasn't real, he couldn't. Not anymore. As Jared approached the front door, the group of men moved toward him with a purpose. The leader, the same man who had confronted Jared weeks ago, stepped forward, his eyes cold and determined. Jared didn't flinch. He had seen this look before, had heard these words before, but this time, there was something different in the air, something more dangerous. "Ma'am one," voice low, threatening. "You need to leave, Jared. This town doesn't want him here. You're making a fool of yourself, and it's time for you to make a choice. You're either with us or against us." Jared's jaw clenched, his body tense with anger, but his voice remained calm. "Jared, steadfast. I'm not leaving, and Caleb's not going anywhere either. He's done nothing wrong, and I'm not backing down just because you're uncomfortable with the choices I've made." The man took a step forward, his face inches from Jared's, his breath hot with fury. "Ma'am one," gritting his teeth. "You think you're better than everyone else? You think you can just bring a man like him into your home and pretend like everything's fine? People like him, they don't belong in this town, and neither do you." Jared didn't budge, standing his ground despite the growing hostility around him. He had made his choice, and nothing would change that. "Jared," calm but firm, "I'm doing what's right. I'm not asking for your approval, but I'm not going to let you dictate who belongs and who doesn't." For a moment, there was nothing but silence between them, the air thick with the weight of the confrontation. Then the leader sneered and took a step back, signaling to the other men. "Ma'am one," snarling. "We warned you, Jared. Now you'll see what happens when you stand in the way of what's right." With those words, they turned and walked away, their backs stiff with anger. Jared stood still for a moment, watching them leave, but the anger that simmered in him didn't fade. Caleb stood at the window, his hands pressed to the glass, watching the men walk away, his heart pounding with a mix of fear and resentment. As the door slammed behind him, Jared walked toward the living room, where Caleb stood waiting. The silence between them was suffocating. Caleb opened his mouth to speak, but the words felt heavy, too heavy to say. "Caleb," voice tight, trembling. "I'm sorry. I'm sorry for putting you in this position. I didn't mean for any of this to happen. I didn't want you to have to fight for me." Jared shook his head, his voice low and full of conviction. "Jared," firmly, "you're not the problem, Caleb. They are. This is about them. This is about people who are too scared to see beyond their own narrow view of the world. You don't owe them anything, and you don't owe me anything either." Caleb looked down, his eyes filled with uncertainty. "But I don't know if I can keep doing this. I don't know if I can keep fighting. I don't know if I'm strong enough to face this kind of hatred." Jared stepped forward, placing a hand on Caleb's shoulder. His eyes were steady, unwavering, as he met Caleb's gaze. "Jared," softly but firmly, "you are strong enough. I see that. I've seen it from the moment I met you, and I'm not going anywhere. We're in this together. You're not alone, Caleb. I'm not going to let you go. Not now, not ever." For the first time in days, Caleb allowed himself to believe those words. The storm outside had been building, and the winds were howling around them. But in this small house, in the quiet space between them, Caleb felt something shift. It was the smallest of moments, but it was enough to make him feel like maybe, just maybe, he could fight back. Not with fists, not with anger, but with the quiet strength Jared had shown him. The next morning, the town was on edge. Word had spread quickly about the confrontation, and the streets were quieter than usual. Caleb stayed inside most of the day, unsure of what to expect. Jared had gone to work, and Caleb, left to his own thoughts, couldn't help but feel the weight of everything. He knew it wasn't over. He knew the town wouldn't back down. But for the first time, he allowed himself to consider that maybe, just maybe, he didn't have to be afraid anymore. The knock on the door came late in the afternoon, a sharp, insistent rapping that made Caleb's heart race. He wasn't sure whether to answer it or pretend he wasn't there. But before he could decide, Jared appeared, his face grim. The door opened to reveal Mrs. Jenkins, the elderly woman who had spoken out in support of Caleb before. But this time, she wasn't alone. Two other women stood behind her, faces serious but filled with resolve. They were the same women who had voiced their support in the past, but this time, it was different. Mrs. Jenkins, with quiet determination, "We're not here to fight. We're here to stand with you. With both of you. If the town's going to make a stand, then so are we. We're tired of being silent." The words hit Caleb like a wave, sweeping over him with a force he hadn't expected. He looked at Jared, who stood beside him, his eyes filled with quiet pride. For the first time, Caleb allowed himself to believe in something more than just survival. "Caleb," softly. "Thank you. I didn't know." Jared placed a hand on his back, the weight of the gesture full of promise. "You don't have to fight alone." In that moment, Caleb understood something he had been afraid to acknowledge. Sometimes, a battle wasn't won alone. Sometimes, it took standing together, shoulder to shoulder, to face the storm. The days after the small but powerful show of support from Mrs. Jenkins and the other women felt different. The atmosphere in Jared's home was lighter, though not without the tension of the times. Caleb, for the first time in weeks, allowed himself to believe that maybe, just maybe, things were changing. The dark cloud that had hovered over him, the constant fear of rejection, hadn't disappeared, but it had shifted, thinning out just enough for a tiny ray of hope to break through. Jared, too, felt the difference. The support of those who had once stood silently by had given him renewed strength. It wasn't just about what he was doing for Caleb anymore. It was about standing up for what was right, no matter the cost. He had drawn a line in the sand, and as he stood on that line, more people began to step forward, inch by inch, ready to walk beside him. But even with this small shift, there was a heaviness in the air. The men who had come to Jared's door weeks ago were still out there, still waiting for their moment to strike. The town hadn't forgotten about Caleb's presence in Jared's home, and neither had the ones who resented Jared for the choice he had made. They had been quiet for a while, but the silence was unsettling, like the calm before the storm. It was late one afternoon when the storm finally broke. Jared had come home from work earlier than expected, a small gesture of reassurance he was offering himself, an attempt to make things feel more normal, more manageable. As he stepped inside, he didn't see Caleb immediately. The house was quiet, almost eerily so. His heart skipped a beat, and he called out, expecting Caleb to answer, to emerge from the kitchen or the living room as he had done every evening since he'd moved in. But there was no answer. Jared frowned and moved deeper into the house, walking through the rooms until he reached the living room. There, standing at the window, was Caleb, his gaze fixed on the street outside, where the shadows were beginning to stretch long in the fading light. "Caleb?" Jared called softly, his voice hesitant as he watched the man standing there, his body tense and still. Caleb turned slowly, and the moment their eyes met, Jared could see the storm inside him. It was written in the lines of Caleb's face, in the tightness of his jaw, in the way his hands trembled at his sides. "There's a group of them out there," Caleb said quietly, his voice raw, as though the words had been stuck in his throat for too long. "They're standing in front of the house." Jared's stomach dropped. He knew what it meant. He had known this day was coming, but now that it was here, it was harder than he had expected. His protective instinct flared, but Caleb's eyes, dark, haunted, spoke volumes. "I can't keep doing this," Caleb whispered, his voice cracking. "I'm not worth all this trouble. I can't keep making your life harder." Jared took a deep breath, stepping toward Caleb. "This isn't just about me, Caleb," he said gently. "This is about what's right. And what's right is you having a chance, having a place to be." Caleb shook his head, tears welling in his eyes, though he refused to let them fall. "You don't understand. They hate me. They don't want me here. And the more I stay, the worse it's going to get for you." The words stung, the reality of Caleb's fears cutting deep. But Jared's voice remained steady, filled with conviction. "They can't scare me, Caleb. Not anymore. You're not a burden. You're a person, and you deserve the same chance as anyone else. I've made my choice, and I'm not going to let them force you out." Caleb took a step back, a hesitant movement, his eyes flickering with doubt. He wanted to believe him, so badly, but the fear that had followed him for so long The fear of rejection, of being cast aside, had a way of making him question everything. But Jared wasn't giving up. He stepped forward, closing the gap between them, his voice soft but firm. "You don't have to do this alone, Caleb. I'm not backing down. Not now. Not ever." For a moment, Caleb simply stood there, his heart racing, torn between the fear of being hurt again and the desire to finally believe that he mattered. And then, as if making a decision, Caleb's shoulders slumped, the weight of his resistance slowly melting away. The walls he had built around himself were starting to crumble. "I'm here," Jared said, his voice like a promise. "And I'm not going anywhere." The evening unfolded quietly, but the unease in the air remained. Caleb sat at the kitchen table, his mind racing. He couldn't shake the image of the men outside, the looks in their eyes, the anger that burned beneath their words. But for the first time in a long time, there was something else inside him, a flicker of something brighter, a spark of hope, no matter how small it seemed. Then, as if on cue, there was a knock at the door. It was the kind of knock that was too forceful to be ignored. Jared and Caleb exchanged a glance, neither of them sure of what would come next. Caleb stood slowly, his heart pounding in his chest. When Jared opened the door, it wasn't the usual group of men standing there. It was Mrs. Jenkins, and this time, she wasn't alone. Behind her stood a small group of neighbors, people Caleb hadn't expected to see, but whose presence now felt like a lifeline. "I think it's time we all said something," Mrs. Jenkins said, her voice steady, as though she had made a decision. "We've been watching, and we can't sit by anymore. If you're standing by him, Jared, then we are too." For a moment, Caleb stood frozen, unable to fully comprehend what was happening. Mrs. Jenkins had been one of the first to speak up, to apologize. But this was something more. These weren't just kind words. They were a statement, a collective refusal to let hate win. "I've been thinking about this a lot," another neighbor, a woman in her 60s, spoke up. "I've been wrong about a lot of things in my life, but I know I'm right about this. We can't sit idly by and let hate define our town." Jared looked at Caleb, a small, quiet smile playing at the corners of his lips. For the first time in days, Caleb allowed himself to believe it. There was something changing. Something was shifting in the town, and it wasn't just about one person helping another. It was about a community beginning to realize that their walls were built on fear, not truth. Caleb blinked, his voice barely a whisper, filled with awe. "You're really doing this?" Mrs. Jenkins stepped forward, placing a hand on Caleb's shoulder. "You're not alone, Caleb. We're with you. And we're not going to let this hatred tear us apart." The words felt like a balm to Caleb's soul. He had lived his life with the belief that he didn't belong, that he was just a forgotten face in the crowd. But now, standing there in the doorway, surrounded by people who had made the decision to stand with him, he felt something he hadn't felt in years: hope. The following days were filled with small, quiet victories. Caleb had always believed that the world was too set in its ways, that people were too set in their prejudices to change. But the support that Jared, Mrs. Jenkins, and the others had shown him planted a seed. And as that seed took root, Caleb began to realize something. Maybe, just maybe, the world could change. It wasn't perfect, it wasn't easy, but it was something. And for the first time in his life, Caleb believed he could be part of that change. Jared, standing beside him, didn't flinch. They both knew the fight wasn't over, but they had found something together. Something that couldn't be broken by hate, no matter how hard the storm raged.